Welcome back to Viral Shakespeare. It's Dr. Rusty Jones, and I'm finishing up Act 1 of Shakespeare's The Tempest, and going to talk a little bit about the case of colonialism as displayed largely in Act 1 through two specific characters that I want to spend a little time focusing on, and that's Ariel and Caliban. Ariel, the almost familiar magical spirit that Prospero uses to exact all of his magical commands, and Caliban, the native, watch the air quotes, monster of the island. And I use those terms, native and monster, in very deliberate ways because that's what I'm going to interrogate today a little bit. But I have to finish off the backstory of how Prospero and his daughter Miranda arrived at the island in the first place. So, still in Act 1, Scene 2, Prospero has been apparently telling Miranda for 12 years since they've been on the island, don't ask about your history, I'm not ready to tell you yet. It's only when she reaches the ripe old age of 15 that he decides he's actually going to tell her something about it. So, Act 1, Scene 2, about line 40 or so. You were not yet out 3 years old, he says, when they arrived on the island 12 years ago, and so you can't remember anything that happened before. Oh, certainly, sir, I can, says Miranda, and Prospero's rather taken aback, and Miranda says at line 44, "'Tis far off and rather like a dream than an assurance that my remembrance warrants. Had I not 4 or 5 women once that tended me?" She remembers a little bit of her noble ancestry, despite the fact that she was basically 3 years old. "Thou hadst," says Prospero in amazement. He then reveals that they have been there for 12 years, which makes Miranda 15, and, oh, for lack of a better term, right on the cusp of maturity, and that's the point that Prospero has chosen to act like both father and mother and move his daughter out of childhood and into maturity, to pair her up with a fellow nobleman that can make a good marriage for her. In this case, it's Ferdinand, and give her a kind of honorable awakening into womanhood by pairing her off with Ferdinand, but extraordinarily carefully, and in a way that to us today seems a little bit over the top. Prospero is both father and mother to her, as I've already mentioned. He's a kind of arch magician. He controls absolutely every aspect of the island and things off the island as well, and he wants to control the maturation of his daughter, so he watches her like a hawk in her dealings with Ferdinand, to the point where he makes himself invisible and stands behind her. We can see him watching her as she and Ferdinand form a bond, but Miranda and Ferdinand cannot see him, which to us feels a little bit extra, as the kids say, a little bit creepy. Is that being a good father? Is that being a good ruler? Is it the opposite of Lear, who's both a bad father and a bad ruler at the beginning of the play? Or is it something to be admired, since basically he is all the parent that Miranda has? He says to her again, "You do not realize that I was the Duke of Milan and a prince of power." And Miranda says, "Sir, are not you my father?" You're the Duke of Milan? I thought you were my dad, just this magician I knew on the island." A little bit of a joke there, and Prospero comes back with another one. "Thy mother was a piece of virtue, and she said thou wast my daughter. And thy father was Duke of Milan." This is a joke that Shakespeare comes back to time and time again. "Aren't you my father?" "Well, your mother always said that I was your father." This kind of anxiety over primogeniture, over the father's role over the family as kind of the main overseer, is treated rather lightly here. Other places in Shakespeare, it's treated much more heavily. "What foul play was it," says Miranda, "that landed us here?" And then begins a very long story, which I'm just going to summarize for you briefly here. On page 9, Act 1, Scene 2, about between lines 68 or so and 116, thereabouts. And the long and the short of it is that Prospero reveals that he was very much invested, as he was Duke of Milan, in, as he says at line 73, the liberal arts, by which he means magic. He is totally invested in his magical books. And as he was focusing strongly on learning magic, as he himself says, he turned over all of the daily runnings of Milan to his brother Antonio. Line 92, "Overprized all popular rate, in my false brother, he," Prospero, "awakened an evil nature by giving him too much authority, by turning too much over to him. And my trust, like a good parent, did beget of him a falsehood in its contrary as great as my trust was, which had indeed no limit, a confidence sans bound." he being thus lorded not only with what my revenue yielded, but what my power might else exact, like one who, having unto truth, by telling of it, made such a sinner of his memory, to credit his own lie, he did believe he was indeed the Duke. He partners up with Alonso, the King of Naples, who's always hated Prospero, and they basically take Prospero, they take the 3-year-old Miranda, they set them adrift in, as it says at line 145, a rotten carcass of a butt, not rigged, nor tackle, sail, nor mast. A rotten, rickety boat, intending to set them adrift and basically let them die out on the open sea. What happened to Mom, the piece of virtue? Don't know. It's a little like a Disney film here. We've got dads, we don't have moms. But that for another day. Miranda then says, oh, as a 3-year-old, I must have been quite a burden to you. And here begins Prospero's discussion of Miranda as one might depict her from a mother's perspective, from a mother's standpoint. Prospero says at line 152 or so, oh, a cherubim, an angel, thou wast that did preserve me while we were on this rickety boat. Thou didst smile, infuse it with a fortitude from heaven, which I have decked the sea, when I have decked the sea with full drops of salt under my burden groan, which raised in me an undergoing stomach to bear up against what should ensue. That language there of having a burden and groaning under it, raising up an undergoing stomach. It's not just the talk of sea and traveling on the sea, it's also the talk of pregnancy. And when they are born up on the Enchanted Island, Prospero basically, metaphorically, gives birth to Miranda. Now he is both mother and father. He is everything to her. How came we ashore? Prospero says, by providence divine. Some food we had and some fresh water that a noble Neapolitan, Gonzalo, out of his charity, had placed there with them. And we're going to meet Gonzalo later, the noble Neapolitan, and a very fine old man who basically saved Prospero and young Miranda. And also included, besides food and clothes and water, included his books. Knowing I love my books, he furnished me from mine own library with volumes that I prize above my dukedom. Saved his magical books, which he has with them on the island. Prospero puts Miranda into an enchanted sleep after giving her all this backstory of her noble background and how they survived out on the open ocean, excuse me, almost by miracle, and then calls to Ariel, his servant. Enter Ariel at about line 188. All hail, great master. Ariel should remind you somewhat of Puck, but whereas Puck's job is basically to make the fairy king smile with his antics, to turn into a stool, and when ladies go to sit on him, to basically pop one of his legs out and fall over, and pop up in milk bowls or ale cups and scare the daylights out of people. He's a mischief maker in that way. He's a Loki figure in that way. But is he really dangerous? No. I mean, he will pretend to be a female horse and drive male horses crazy, that kind of thing. He's a trickster in that way. Ariel is more evocative, I think, of an indentured servant at the time, which brings up the question of colonialism, which I'm going to get to in a second here. But Ariel is the familiar magical spirit that Prospero controls. But as the dialogue with Prospero evolves, we hear that he is, in fact, essentially an indentured servant, made to serve Prospero for a particular time. Now, indenture was something that Shakespeare's audience would have been very familiar with outside of colonialism, outside of slavery. This was a system that had been in place for a very long time. Basically, you take your child, you turn the child over to someone who has a particular skill, a blacksmith, for example, or a leather worker or whatever, and you are beholden to that master for a period of years. You work with them for free. They give you room, they give you board, they teach you the skill, and then after a set number of years, you are basically set loose and you can start your own business with whatever skill it was that you learned. Shakespeare's own father, John Shakespeare, had indentured servants that worked in his leather shop. They slept in a little sort of upstairs attic space. They gave them food, they gave them lodging. They probably gave them clothing and that sort of thing, and possibly a small allowance, but they taught them the trade of leatherworking. Ariel works in this same way. Now, where this might cross over a little bit with colonialism is that in some cases, native peoples were brought over to the New World as, quote, indentured servants, who would serve as servants for a time and then be released. That was, of course, a lie. they were there as slaves and they would never be released. And other times that ruse wasn't even brought forth. It was simply they were kidnapped from wherever it was that they were living, potentially on the west coast of Africa, and they were brought over to Europe. They were brought over to Spain. They were brought over to Jamestown, Portugal, etc. And they were never going to be released, no matter what. But indentured servitude is a very familiar station in Shakespeare's time period, and that seems to be what Ariel is. Prospero asks, have you done everything that I asked you to do? He says, yes. The sailors are all asleep. I've stored the ship away. No one's been harmed, although I did flame like fire and scare the living daylights out of all of them. But nobody is harmed, not a hair out of place, he says. Not a hair blemish, not at all. And then I took Ferdinand and I set him on one side of the island. I took Alonso and Antonio and that group, Gonzalo, etc. I set them on the other side of the island. Just like you asked, I've done everything that you wanted me to do. Line 234 or so, thereabouts, a little farther down, 237. Prospero says, Ariel, thy charge exactly is performed, but there's more work. And Ariel becomes upset. In a rather surprising way, he pushes back against his magical master. Is there more toil? Line 242. Since thou dost give me pains, let me remember thee what thou hast promised, which is not yet performed me. Prospero responds with, how now? Moody, what is it thou canst demand? My liberty. And that brings up the question not only of indentured servitude, but slavery as well. That is an interesting word to be used at this time period. My liberty. Before the time be out, no more. And before the time be out nods back to indentured servitude. I prithee, remember I have done thee worthy service, says Ariel, told thee no lies, made no mistakes, served without or grudge or grumblings. Thou did promise to bait me a full year. I've been held over for some time. Dost thou forget from what a torment I did free thee? No, says Ariel, thou dost. And he says, I'm going to remind you of the torment that I freed you from. He then calls Ariel a malignant thing, a terrible thing. Have you forgot? Hast thou forgot the foul witch Sycorax, who with age and envy was grown into a hoop? Hast thou forgot that? Where did she come from? Algiers, says Ariel. He makes Ariel rehearse the whole story of how Ariel came to this island with Sycorax, who was sent there from Algeria. She was a witch, a blue-eyed hag, as it says here. Who was banished. This blue-eyed hag was hither brought with child, so pregnant witch Sycorax is sent to exile on this island with her servant Ariel. There she gives birth to Caliban, of course, who is then the native of the Enchanted Island and the rightful owner of it because he is native of it. He was actually born there. Finally, Ariel, as we are told, excuse me, is imprisoned, as it says here, at about line 273, into a cloven pine for refusing to do the terrible behests of Sycorax the witch, within which rift imprisoned thou didst painfully remain 12 years, within which space she died and left thee there, where thou didst vent thy groans as fast as mill wheels strike. Then was this island, save for the son that she did litter here, a freckled whelp, hagborn, it's a reference to Caliban, we'll come back to that, not honored with a human shape. Also something important to remember. Not honored, Caliban is, with a human shape. Yes, Caliban, her son. Dull thing I say so, says Prospero. He, that Caliban, whom now I keep in service. Thou best knowest what torment I did find thee in. Thy groans did make wolves howl and penetrate the breasts of ever angry bears. It was a torment to lay upon the damned, which Sycorax could not again undo. It was mine art, when I arrived and heard thee, that made gape the pine and let thee out. I thank thee, master, says Ariel, now somewhat, humbled and beaten down, verbally anyway. And Prospero then threatens him. If you continue to murmur, he says, I will rend an oak, I will tear an oak apart, and peg thee, put thee, in his knotty entrails, till thou hast howled away 12 winters. I'll stick you in an oak, and you'll be there for 12 years, which is exactly what Sycorax did to him. How is Prospero better than Sycorax? In this formulation, is Prospero basically a witch? Here for a while, he seemed like he was the good master to Ariel, the indentured servant. Now he seems like a kind of angry slave master saying, look, I'm going to put the worst kind of torments on you, the same as the witch Sycorax, if you don't do exactly what I say, and if you dare to talk back to me again. So what is Prospero? A nice indentured servant master teaching somebody a trade, or this kind of evil taskmaster who throwing his servants around and treating them very much like slaves? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm searching currently for that word, yes, at line 270, Prospero actually says, thou, my slave, as thou reportest thyself, was then her servant. So it really is a blurring here of slave and servant. Prospero has called Ariel both, and also at other times calls Ariel, my chick, and other terms of endearment. The relationship with Ariel is very confusing. Later in the play, Ariel's going to ask Prospero, "Do you love me?" And it seems to be a very poignant question. Am I nothing but a slave to you? Am I a servant that you're just basically jerking around? Or do you actually love me? And Prospero says, yes, I do. But I do want you to question that. I'm not completely convinced of it. Before we meet Caliban, and wanted to spend just a second or two talking about colonialism, and hopefully then I will get to Caliban with any luck. I'm going to show you some slides here. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Hopefully they won't be too obscure. But basically, I'm drawing from a work by Meredith Ann Skura, The Case of Colonialism in the Tempest. And Skura argues that there is so much language of colonialism from the time about what it is to go to the new world and encounter new people, a language of adventure, romance, power, authority, slaves, servants, everything that I brought up before. And she, in her article, is countering the idea that The Tempest is about the colonial ventures that England had taken upon itself in the early part of the 17th century. She says that language is both interrogated in the play and utilized to look at other discourses. The discourse of colonialism is one discourse operating in the play, but it's also a discourse that is analyzed and is utilized to talk about other things like power and authority and family relations and master-servant relationships and all kinds of things. I tend to agree with Skura, except when you evoke the language of colonialism, it doesn't mean that the play is about colonialism, either pro or con colonialism, but it definitely engages with colonialism by using its discourse and employing it for whatever reasons Shakespeare has. It's impossible to get away from the question of colonialism in the play, and in typical Shakespearean fashion, as opposed to taking a side, it's good, it's bad, he gives us many different sides of the colonial venture, the romantic side and the truly ugly side, and he lets them exist, and he lets us see them and be the judge to some degree. Is Prospero a beneficial magus, controlling everything to everyone's benefit, from his daughter down to the lowliest servant? Well, maybe. That's a very romantic view. Is he a very typical colonial slave master, using his authority and using his power over those with lesser authority and lesser power and making their lives absolutely miserable for his own benefit? And the answer to that is also yes. So you need to look at it that way. We talked about rabbits and ducks with Henry V. It's a little bit like that with Prospero. But the colonial venture, you expected to find magic and you expected to find monsters. Why would you do that? Well, because these were profit-making enterprises. The East India Company had been set up under Queen Elizabeth, and these companies that funded explorations into the New World needed to make money, and one of the best ways to do it was to fulfill people's expectations. You thought, you go to a new world, you go to Middle America, South America, North America, people expect you to find things that aren't in the old world. They expect you to find monsters. They expect you to find new flora, new fauna, different kinds of people. And that's exactly what they did find, whether they actually did or not. They brought these reports back so that people would be intrigued and they would put more money into it and the ventures would continue and hopefully succeed. So I want to flip this around and show you one of the monsters that people expected to find in the New World, known as the Blemii, and these are mentioned directly in the play, The Tempest. So if this doesn't work, forgive me. Very low tech here. There we go. I'm going to peek my head over to make sure that that is in frame. There we go. It's probably not a great shot. But the Blemii are mentioned by Gonzalo in Act 3, Scene 3. And you see them there. The Blemii are men whose heads grow in their breasts. "When we were boys," says Gonzalo, "who would believe that there were mountaineers dewlapped like bulls whose throats had hanging at 'em wallets of flesh?" Answer, nobody, but that's what people expected to find when they went into the wild places. Or that there were such men whose heads stood in their breasts, those are the Blemii, which now we find each putter out of 5 for one will bring us good warrant of. Each putter out of 5 are the people that actually invest in New World ventures, and once they go to the New World, they come back with reports about monstrous native peoples like the Blemii. Why? So that these ventures can be justified, so that they can make money. Some of the let me leave this here. Some of the romantic narrative crosses the line, in fact, when you've got monsters and native people, into justifications for putting out 5 to 1 monetarily and going to these new worlds and encountering new peoples, and in some cases doing great damage to them. So, if I flip to the next slide here, forgive my arm in the way. These are some prints from Theodore de Brie and his brief and true report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, with illustrations by de Brie and his associate Giesbert van Veen. Some of these illustrations of the native peoples of North America are rather scientific, and they tend to lack both romance and justification for the colonial venture. Like this one, it's a pretty straightforward image of a native woman from the front and from the back, and some of them tend to be a bit more romanticized, and if you can call a picture like this a discourse, it's also a justification for the English contact with the New World. These are English soldiers. The gentleman they're talking to is a Native American chief. Notice how large he is. He's way bigger than they are, yet he is smiling down benignly at them, almost welcoming them into the New World, which is a discourse that helps to justify the English presence there. This one is supposedly a Native American wedding celebration, which bears a remarkable resemblance to royal processions that Queen Elizabeth and King James went on, amongst others. So it's a bit of a justification for their presence in the New World. Look, these folks do things very much like us. All they need is a little bit of a push, a little bit of, quote, civilization to make them like us. This is definitely a piece of propaganda. This is Captain John Smith there, the guy with the pistol, holding the hair of the Powhatan chief. The date on this portrait is 1603. The Powhatan chief has John Smith by the neck and is kind of holding him off the ground, kind of Darth Vader style from A New Hope. I don't know what John Smith's going to do with that pistol. It doesn't look like he's going to shoot him, maybe hit him with it. Notice how gigantic and monstrous the Native American is. Notice in the background how many native peoples there are against such a small number of Englishmen with guns, and the propaganda here becomes clear. Look how brave we are facing down these thousands and thousands of native, I wish you could see my air quotes, savages here. Aren't we brave? Aren't we just amazing for being here and enduring such trials? Aren't we heroic to face down these monsters? This last one that I want to show you here is a bit of revenge fantasy from the English. This is a depiction of, I believe it's Middle Americans and Spanish conquistadors. And as you can see, the native peoples have captured the conquistadors. They're cutting off arms and legs. They're having a little bonfire in the back there and engaging in cannibalism. And the man in the foreground, the conquistador in the foreground, is getting molten gold poured down his throat. The message here, I think, to anyone viewing that particular engraving would essentially be, if you are English anyway, look, the Spanish were there basically to rape and pillage, but not us, not us. We are in the New World to spread civilization. We are explorers. We are bringing good religion to these people. We are the kind masters. We are not the masters who are tearing up and killing people randomly for gold or for whatever it is. We get similar kind of justifications and similar kind of condemnations in the depiction of Prospero and his relationship to both Ariel, the familiar magical spirit, and Caliban, who is described in various ways, freckled whelp, hag-born, born of a witch, not graced with a human shape. He's called slave multiple times by Prospero, who threatens to torture him left and right. I don't know if I'm going to have time to get to some of the pictures of Caliban that I have. Perhaps I will, so let me bring up this slideshow just in case I have time to get there. There we go. But when we have Caliban's entrance, Act 1, Scene 2, about line 320, first thing he does is to curse Prospero. As wicked do as ever my mother brush with raven's feather from unwholesome fen, drop on you both. A southwest blow on ye and blister you all over. And Prospero says, for this tonight you shall have cramps and side stitches. I'm going to make sure my magic torments you for the curses that you have given me. Then Caliban is given a speech that some say is very reminiscent of what the native peoples would have undergone when the colonists arrived from the old world. So this brings up Skura's point about this particular work. The colonial venture had been happening for over a century as far as the Spanish were concerned, but the English were fairly new to it as a nation. As I said, Jamestown had only been founded in 1607. This play dates from around 1610, 1611. So for the English, it's a fairly new experience to be part of the colonial venture, for lack of a better term. Although they're aware of its ramifications on native peoples. Like I said, the Spanish have been doing it for 100 years. Caliban says, this island's mine, about line 331, by Sycorax my mother. And he's right. By the terms of how you get property newly discovered, if you're the first one there, it's yours. And Sycorax was sent there. She was exiled there, but her child was born there. This island is his, and he is right. This island's mine by Sycorax my mother, which thou takest from me. True. When thou camest first, when you first got here, says Caliban, thou strokest me, and made much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light, and how the less. You taught me that this was named the sun, and this one was named the moon, that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, where you get fresh water, brine pits, barren place and fertile. Cursed be I that did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you. For I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king. And here you sty me, that word sty. You sty a pig in a sty. That's how you treat me, he says, in this hard rock, whilst you do keep from me the rest of the island. And he's not wrong. Thou most lying slave, Prospero says. Is he really lying? I mean, this is very evocative discourse of what happened when native peoples first met colonizers from the old world. They came in, they were fairly good relations, they showed them the good places of the island where they could get water and the rest of it. And how were they rewarded by this? They were overtaken, they were murdered, they were enslaved, etc. It's a fairly well-known narrative from the time. Prospero kicks back and calls him a lying slave. Calling him a slave doesn't really help your argument here, Prospero, but okay. Thou most lying slave, whom stripes may move, not kindness. Who being whipped will move, not kindness. Slavery did not come to Jamestown until a couple of decades or so, after the Tempest, and yet the slave trade was well known. Stripes are evocative of the particular violent aspects of slavery. I have used thee, filth as thou art, with human care, and lodged thee in my own cell. Sounds a little bit like gaslighting. I treated you really well, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child, till you tried to rape Miranda. Oh ho, says Caliban, wouldst had been done. Thou didst prevent me. I didn't actually get to rape Miranda. I had peopled else this isle with Calibans. I mentioned before in Henry V that there's the French have this fear of misogyny, of racial mixing. They say, oh my gosh, the English are going to breed us out, basically. And Henry V wants racial mixing. He wants a French and an English boy who's going to be able to continue on the Crusades. Here, Caliban also sort of evokes that anxiety in Shakespeare's culture of racial mixing. Oh my goodness, if only I'd got Miranda, we could have had a mixed race, half monster, half beautiful European woman from the old world, half new world, half old world. Wouldn't that have been amazing? And Miranda says, basically kicked back and says, this is a terrible thing you tried to do. I was the one, says Miranda, that took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou did not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish. Then says she is part of, or says that Caliban is part of a vile race. She uses this racial language. And Caliban says that the only thing he ever got from being taught the English language is, you taught me language, and my profit on it is, I know how to curse. And I have reason to do so from the way that I'm treated. Now, how are we supposed to read this as part of the colonial narrative? Is Prospero correct when he says he's lying, that Caliban's always been bad? It doesn't sound that way. It sounds like he was very nice when they arrived, and his error was trying to rape Miranda. And since then, he has been treated as a slave, threatened with stripes, tormented by Prospero. Is it justified? Some might argue that it is. Others argue that it's a sign that Prospero is the kind of emblem of the evil colonial master treating the native peoples of the island with cruelty, in essence. Let's see how much time I've got left. That's 30 minutes. I will go back to depictions of Caliban next time. We'll talk a little bit more about colonialism, finish off Act 1, and we will make it through the rest of the play soon. So take care.